Who is Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky? Volodymyr Zelensky is one of the biggest names in the news right now. That's because he's currently leading Ukraine through one of their most trying times in decades. The Russian invasion. As you're probably well aware right now, Putin, the Russian leader, has launched a full-scale invasion in Ukraine. World leaders around the globe have pretty much publicly condemned this move. However, even though Biden, Boris Johnson, and others have come out and said they aren't happy with this, they aren't necessarily throwing their troops at this war to help Ukraine out. They are assisting in other ways, but it's largely up to Ukraine to deal with this. Which also means that it's largely up to Volodymyr Zelensky. So who is this guy who is all of a sudden fighting for his country's freedom? Where did he come from, and most importantly, is he capable of leading his country through this extremely dark and trying time? Well, for starters, he was born in 1978 to Jewish parents. His father was a professor of cybernetics and computing, and his mother was an engineer, so safe to say they were both very smart. His early life saw him do very well in school. He learned English and received a grant to go and study in Israel. He never actually went because his father wouldn't let him, but he did earn a law degree from Kryvyi Rih Institute of Economics. Law wasn't his true passion though, and he never actually pursued a career in that field. Instead, Zelensky was a bit of a joker. When he was 17 years old, he joined the KVN, which is a comedy group in Ukraine. He participated with this group and other comedic groups for quite a while and saw a lot of success. Eventually, he gained enough of a name for himself that in the early 2000s he could start producing TV shows for some Ukrainian channels, which then launched his career on the big screen. Love in the Big City and Love in the Big City 2 saw Zelensky really thrive on the screen and saw some decent success. This led him to perform in some other roles, which actually included him doing the voice for Paddington Bear in the Ukrainian versions of the film. These were just a few of his most notable credits, but he's definitely been around the block when it comes to film and television. So how is it possible that somebody who was voicing a cute little bear in 2017 is now leading a nation through an invasion 5 years later? Well, his political career is certainly a bit of an anomaly. Public opinion of him was very high based off of his TV and film career, and he used this to launch himself onto the political scene. Wikipedia writes, 6 months before he announced his candidacy for the Ukrainian presidential election in 2019, Zelensky was already one of the frontrunners in opinion polls. After months of ambiguous responses during the Kvartal 95 New Year's Eve evening show on the TV channel 1+1, he announced his candidacy for the election. In doing so, he upstaged the New Year's Eve address of President Petro Poroshenko on that particular channel. This was the beginning of a very unique political campaign where Zelensky largely avoided talk shows because he said he didn't want to just do PR. This strategy paid off, and on April 21st, 2019, he beat out his opponent with an overwhelming 73% of the vote. The first 2 years of his presidency were pretty uneventful considering what's happening right now. He was largely popular with the people though, and other than a minor vacation scandal where Zelensky snuck away for a few days, he hasn't been hit with too much bad press. Fast forward to February 24th of 2022, only 4 days ago, and Zelensky gets hit with the biggest problem he will tackle in his entire life. Putin invades. At this point, Zelensky had been calling out to the world for months, telling them that this was coming and trying to speed up the process of getting into NATO as a way of protecting the country. The admittance to NATO took longer than he wanted though, and as we've seen in the last few days, Russian troops have been storming the country. Before they did this, there were many articles talking about the potential of this invasion, and one thing that they kept coming back to was Zelensky's leadership. Many of the articles that I read were very critical in their opinion of how Zelensky would handle an invasion if it did occur. Many of these critics thought that he would cave under the pressure. This war isn't ending anytime soon, and he could still cave, but so far, he has definitely risen to the occasion. Wikipedia once again says, in the early hours of 26 February, during the most significant assault by Russian troops on the capital of Kiev, the United States government urged Zelensky to evacuate to a safer location and said it stood ready to assist him in such an effort. Zelensky turned down the offer and opted to remain in Kiev with its defensive forces, saying that "The fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride." Zelensky gained worldwide recognition as the wartime leader of Ukraine during the Russian invasion. Historian Andrew Roberts compared him to Winston Churchill, and he has been described as a national hero in Ukraine. He contributed to the renewed popularity of the Salute Slava Ukraini as a symbol of resistance. It's actions like this that will give Ukraine a fighting chance. On paper, they are severely outmanned, outgunned, and at a major disadvantage. This is simply looking at the numbers though and doesn't factor in human spirit and resilience. The only way Ukraine is going to be able to last through something like this is if the entire country rallies behind their leader and fights back against these invaders. By sticking with his people and refusing to flee, he has sent a clear message to the Ukrainian people and to the Russians that they will not back down from this fight. It should also be noted that if the Russians capture Kiev and ultimately find Zelensky, then he will most likely be killed or at the very least imprisoned. It is also believed that Zelensky's handling of the situation so far has rallied the West to go a lot further and faster with their sanctions than they were planning to do. The Russian currency is currently dropping like a stone, and that is large in part to the massive sanctions being imposed on them from some of the huge Western economies. Weapons and arms have also been promised to the Ukrainian people from some nations, something that experts didn't expect to happen. So far, Zelensky is doing everything in his power to give Ukraine a fighting chance and stand up to Russia. There will be a meeting on the 28th of February where the two sides of Ukraine and Russia will discuss certain things. What that meeting will entail and if there's anything either side can do to bring peace is unknown, but at the very least they will be meeting at the table. We're still learning who President Volodymyr Zelensky is as a person and as a leader, but the signs are initially indicating that he might just have what it takes to lead his country through one of their darkest moments.
What if America fought Russia in Ukraine? It's been almost a week since Russia began its unprovoked attack on Ukraine after weeks and months of buildup. All the way back in October, President Joe Biden was informed by his national security team of the grim plans Putin had to invade and start what would potentially go on to become the largest war on European soil since the Second World War, and maybe even World War III. The world has responded by placing harsh sanctions on Russia, which has severely damaged the country economically, and many countries have been sending military aid and weaponry and financial assistance to Ukraine in order to help them defend themselves. In terms of sanctions being imposed on Russia, there has been asset freezes for the largest banks, debt and equity restrictions on critical mining, transportation, and logistics firms, and there has even been quite a huge effort to shut down access to some of the technology that is critical and key for the Russian military and the industrial sectors. Also, just a few days ago, the US, the European Commission, along with France, Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, and Canada announced that they would be expelling certain Russian banks from SWIFT, which is the high-security network that connects thousands of financial institutions from around the world. Many world leaders have emphasized that these are not the last of the sanctions should Russia continue on its war path it's on right now. In terms of financial and military aid, the United States specifically has responded by firstly directing that $350 million through the Foreign Assistance Act be designated for Ukraine's defense. President Biden then instructed the State Department to release up to an additional $350 million worth of weapons from US stocks to Ukraine. The Pentagon has also said that weapons, including anti-armor, small arms, body armor, and various munitions, will be sent in order to support Ukraine's frontline defenders, and a State Department spokesperson said that these arms also include anti-aircraft systems, which Ukraine is said to have specifically asked for. It is said that over the past year, the United States has committed more than $1 billion in security assistance to Ukraine, and while that is great and very helpful, many people are wondering why the US hasn't sent any troops over. Firstly, despite Ukraine's desire to be, at this point in time, they are not a member of the NATO alliance. The US has deployed thousands of troops throughout Europe, both before and during this invasion, and of the some 4,000 troops that have been deployed, they've had their tour of duty extended, most likely likely for several weeks to come. These troops are not there to fight the Russians, however. These troops are there to help defend and support the NATO countries that lie around Ukraine. President Biden has explicitly said that they are there to support, quote, our NATO allies and reassure those allies in the East. As I made crystal clear, the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory with the full force of American power. But he has also said that US forces, quote, are not and will not be engaged in a conflict with Russia in Ukraine. This, of course, leads us to the question of what scenario would have to arise for the US to engage in this conflict with Russia directly. There has to be one, right? Ukraine borders the NATO member countries of Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, and if Russia were to threaten any one of these countries, the United States, along with France, Germany, the UK, and the rest of the NATO alliance, would be required by Article 5 of the treaty to respond accordingly. Article 5 is what guarantees that the resources of the whole alliance can be used to protect any single member nation. The first and only time it has ever been invoked was in the aftermath of the September 11th, 2001 attacks on the US. This is what led to NATO allies joining in on the invasion of Afghanistan. It's important to look at a similar situation that has happened in the past, and that is the 1990 invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. This was a war of territorial aggression, and the next year the US and an allied coalition intervened in the war with the support of the United Nations Security Council because, of course, they were against this invasion. It's not the same situation, but it's fundamentally comparable to the one that is currently ongoing, and it makes us ask ourselves, why did the US get involved in that war but are extremely opposed to this one, especially considering how Ukrainian leaders have been pleading for Western assistance? Well, my friends, while there are quite a few things that aren't similar about this invasion and the previous one, the most important is that Saddam Hussein did not have nuclear weapons. Vladimir Putin, on the other hand, has about 6,000 of them. It's the same sort of logic that made the Cold War what it was. It's this idea of, if you're going to destroy me, I'll destroy the entire world while I go down. Russia's huge arsenal of nuclear weaponry makes intervention riskier than ever before, and it makes the situation all the more precarious. Throughout this conflict, I learned about what political scientists call the stability paradox, and it's how Putin was even able to invade in the first place. Basically, it's the idea that nuclear arms and wanting to deter using them is actually a paradox that makes regular or traditional warfare more likely. Like in this case, Putin knew that because of his nuclear capabilities, that the United States and other allies wouldn't necessarily come to Ukraine's defense directly, because intervening comes with the imminent threat of nuclear warfare, and no leader is willing to take that chance. This has given Putin the confidence to feel as though he could succeed. I mean, he even said it himself. During the very beginning of the invasion, while on TV declaring war, he declared that, quote, anyone who would consider interfering from the outside will, quote, face consequences greater than any you have faced in history. This is the most thinly veiled nuclear threat I've ever heard. The United States is extremely powerful when it comes to nuclear arms, but so is Russia. In fact, it is estimated that between the two countries alone is 90% of the world's nuclear arms. There is no guarantee that sending US troops to Ukraine would, without a doubt, result in nuclear warfare, but it is highly likely and a risk that, at the moment, the president is not willing to take. It's not an easy decision by any stretch of the imagination, because there are reasons why America and the US need to care about this war, but when your nation's safety is on the line, the stakes couldn't be higher. This war is a threat to democracy, it's a threat to the rule of law, and it's a threat to the things that the United States really stands for and has throughout its history. Moscow has no legal basis to insist any portion of Ukrainian land or territory, and if the West begins to accept Russia's claims, it undermines the sovereignty of all countries. And is this the precedent we want to set, where other nations can gain more territory through military force? It's important to remember that other countries are watching to see how everyone reacts to this conflict. I'm not suggesting that the West has just been silent and ignoring the problem, because I don't think that that's true, but it's just important for us to remember why we should care. We see these things on the news and it's easy to remove ourselves from the situation, but this war is not just about Russia and Ukraine. It will have ripple effects throughout the world. If the US were to send in troops and nuclear warfare was to ensue, there's an interesting thing that would happen, or Rather, it's a terrifying thing. Both countries have second strike capabilities. This means that either side, should it receive a devastating blow, would still be able to retaliate. This is because both Russia and the US have what is called the nuclear triad, which means that they have bombers armed with nuclear bombs, submarines equipped with nuclear missiles, and land-based missile launchers. This means that whatever country were to strike first, they could completely demolish military bases and high population centers, but they could still receive a retaliation hit because of submarines that are out at sea that have nuclear capabilities. You get what I mean? So between the two countries, sending a nuclear strike almost guarantees that you're going to receive one back. This is exactly the reason why it seems as though President Biden is adamant on not getting involved in Ukraine. The only way that it would seem plausible for the US to begin a conflict with a nuclear power such as Russia is if the US homeland was at risk and it was done to protect them. The United States, along with many other countries, continues to pledge that it will help Ukraine defend itself, but as of now, people are not prepared to take the risk unless things continue to escalate.
So we're all scared of what's going on in Ukraine right now. Our leaders are concerned, our parents are concerned, but keep in mind that it's almost impossible to imagine how the Ukrainian people themselves are feeling. And all this fear and suffering is stemming from the actions of one individual, Vladimir Putin. But what if I told you that Putin himself might be even more scared than any of us? There are reports that Putin is on extremely high alert right now, which I'm sure you're aware of, even putting Russia's nuclear forces on high alert and hiding his family in a Siberian nuclear bunker. His reasons for this paranoia are both legitimate and completely unfounded. So let's get into why that is. To get to our first answer, we have to review Putin's apparent motivation to enter Ukraine. Putin is justifying this unprovoked attack by claiming that it's not an attack at all, but an act of defense. An act of defense against what he claims is a rising level of systematic anti-Semitism in Ukraine, which is totally unfounded, as well as what he claims is a potential threat that NATO will take over the formerly Soviet state. And as much as Ukraine has adopted a healthy democratic system in the last 10 years, the idea that the West has any interest in using Ukraine to impede on Russia's sovereignty is also entirely unfounded. But he doesn't seem to think so, or does he? It's hard to tell if Putin actually fears that the West will do something, or if he's just using it as a reason to satiate his primal desire for more land, and to continue his helpless conquest to reunite the long-disbanded USSR. But I'd say it's more likely that Putin actually is paranoid that the United West is infringing on his way of life, because otherwise it's extremely hard to draw any string of clear logic from his decisions to start the invasion. And since his declaration of war, Putin might also genuinely believe that NATO is planning a nuclear strike on his land, which is apparently why he's doing things like putting his family into a Siberian nuclear bunker. But again, this fear is just that, a fear. It's entirely unfounded in truth. There's no definitive answer as to why he's paranoid, but my best guess is that the resistance of the heroic Ukrainian people has taken Putin off guard, and has also galvanized Russian citizens to speak out in their own country. These domestic protests within Russia are breaking through a barrier of fear that's been otherwise holding them back from speaking out against Putin for the last 20 years or so. So I'm not claiming that I can read Putin's mind, but I can speculate and assume that his fears are deriving from a multivariate equation of isolation, paranoia, and regret, whether he'd like to admit it or not. With all of the world either against him or too afraid to outwardly back him, this is currently, as of this video being posted, a fight that Putin seems to be fighting alone. And this is precisely why dictatorships are so dangerous, because one person can make any decision they choose at any given time that will impact the lives of so many, and sometimes that person is not in their right mind. Without the willingness for ideas to be corroborated with another faction that might hold opposing beliefs to their own, the dictator takes on all the pressure, all the exhaustion, all the fear and paranoia that a world event or major political decision would yield. It's just not good. So there's another reason for his hiding. The stakes of his war are so high for the future of so many millions, and arguably billions of lives, that he knows his own life as an individual is in extreme danger. Because, let's be honest, it only takes one oligarch who misses the masseuse on his super yacht to turn on Putin, and also get the accolade of saving Europe as we know it in the process. When there's a good enough incentive, people will flip on a dime, and Putin is at least smart enough to know that. The last and simplest reason why Putin is in hiding right now is that he isn't a good leader. He leads with fear, keeping those below him in control on a faulty basis. But as soon as that fear alleviates, his whole operation comes crumbling down. I've seen a lot of people trying to compare Putin to Hitler, and it's just not an accurate comparison. Hitler convinced everyone of his insane motivations and tragically gained a powerful army because of it. But in Putin's case, at least as of posting this video, very few seem to be buying what he's selling. And that's a really good sign for the rest of the world. He's also a bad leader for the simple fact that he's in hiding at all. Just look at the powerful, effective leadership of Volodymyr Zelensky. He is risking everything, his own life, his family's life, just to show his people that their cause is worth fighting for. He's doing everything but hiding, and look how it's changing the whole outcome of this tragic event. It has already turned the tides of this war and will continue to influence the outcome of history with every brave act of leadership he takes. So if Putin is going to hide from the potentially life-threatening consequences of his own actions, maybe it'll help him sleep at night, but it won't be helping advance his cause by any stretch of the imagination. And if he wants to keep his family in a nuclear bunker, then he can do that too. But it's pretty clear to everyone else that he should not be concerned about a nuclear attack. There's just no benefit in it for the West, nor is it something any stable government would do, since most countries choose to draw a line in the sand on certain moral and ethical bases. His reasoning just doesn't make any sense. But I will say this, the reports of him keeping distance from his confidants is the only thing that he's not overthinking, because there's a whole lot of incentive for any of his allies to flip on him right now. The irony is palpable that he's in fear of his own life, considering he's been leading his country with fear for years, and whether he's got a guilty conscience or a bad case of paranoia, there's no debating that he did it to himself. There's a price for everything, and it's not always a red number on a spreadsheet, no matter how much the sanctions will make that a reality for him as well.
Is the Chernobyl nuclear disaster happening again? It's been decades since the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear disaster, which sent nuclear materials flying up into the sky as high as 5 miles. At the time, the United Nations predicted that the long-term death toll of the disaster would be around 4,000 people, but it's likely that the disaster caused many, many more deaths than that estimate would suggest. Since this disaster, Chernobyl has been basically a ghost town. I mean, not many people are jumping at the chance to live in an area that is rife with radioactivity, and certainly no one is very interested in being around a nuclear power plant that has such a track record. So, why did Russia want it? It's been about a week since Russian forces, while invading Ukraine, overtook the Chernobyl facility, and it's anyone's guess as to why. It's likely a move of convenience. I mean, it's on the way from Belarus, which we all know has been acting as a sort of ally to Russia during this illegal invasion, on the way to Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital that is currently under assault. Kyiv is extremely important to Ukraine, and the Russian forces are doing anything they can to capture it. Maybe it's a move of convenience, or perhaps, maybe, as the defense minister of Russia claimed, it's a move to protect that infrastructure so as to prevent any sort of, quote, nuclear provocation. This is all interesting, but perhaps the most terrifying of all of the explanations came when a Russian security source claimed that the capturing of the power plant was meant to be a warning for NATO. Russian forces overtaking Chernobyl is a real slap in the face to the Ukrainian people. These are the people who have spent decades trying not to have a repeat of the disaster that shook many of their lives. These are the same people who spent money on resources to assure that such a disaster would never happen again on their watch, and many of these people likely knew someone who lost their life or had other adverse effects from the radiation released into the atmosphere that day. The memory of this disaster is ingrained into the Ukrainian people, who will do anything to never have a moment like that happen again. This is exactly what makes this situation so serious. Ukraine's Minister of Energy said in a statement that the Russia control of the site is, quote, one of the most appalling threats to Europe today. When the Chernobyl disaster occurred, Ukraine was a part of the then still standing Soviet Union, and although there's been decades, the Ukrainian people have not forgotten the Soviet Union's complete disregard for their lives. While Russian forces have in fact captured Chernobyl, the news unfortunately gets worse. This is not the only nuclear power plant they've managed to take hold of, and there are some that pose quite a huge risk to our entire world. So much so that it is said that should these plants be tampered with by the Russian forces, it will be like nuclear warfare without bombs. With the 1986 disaster, we all saw just how badly things can go without anyone even saying the word weapon, let alone using one. The plants themselves are the weapons. The overtaking of these plants gives Russia the power to unleash a similar kind of disaster, or even worse should they choose. They have the power to undo all of the work that Ukraine has done to recover from the disaster, and they also have the power to make Ukraine a completely uninhabitable place to live for decades to come. They don't only have the power to create another Chernobyl, they have a chance to do something much, much worse. Russian forces could potentially have the power to unleash several International Atomic Energy Agency Level 7 accidents in just a few days. For reference, that's the highest level on the scale. It would make the entire country of Ukraine unlivable, just like the exclusion zones in Chernobyl we still see despite the almost 40 years it's been since the disaster. This nuclear threat was always a huge worry even before this illegal invasion and the war began. Ukraine is very heavily dependent on nuclear power and has been tending to and maintaining 4 nuclear power plants. This means that there are 15 nuclear reactors that are really at risk when it comes to the invasion, which is something that is quite unprecedented in our world. Having this many reactors in a war zone, it really creates a completely different scenario and risk than the world has ever seen before. This is why these plants are an issue for both NATO and non-aligned countries alike. It's a global issue. As of now, just last night, the fear over this potential nuclear disaster only grew as a part of one of Europe's largest nuclear plants caught on fire. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is the second largest in Europe and is one of the 10 largest in the entire world. This is the plant that is responsible for about a quarter of Ukraine's electricity. This plant was caught on fire due to the Russian forces that were shelling the area, and while it was extremely alarming, US Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm tweeted that the plant's reactors were protected by robust containment structures and that they were safely being shut down. That doesn't mean there is no room for fear, however. It appears as though the reactor that was set ablaze was one that was actually under renovation and wasn't operating at the time, but there was still nuclear fuel inside. Alarm bells really went off when Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs tweeted, quote, "If it blows up, it will be 10 times larger than Chernobyl." Of course, people were panicked by this, but experts rebutted the claim, saying that while this situation is most definitely extremely dangerous, it is unlikely to produce a sort of apocalyptic explosion. This doesn't mean that there wouldn't be absolutely catastrophic results, it's just saying that should an explosion occur in this one plant, the world isn't going to end right there and then. The comparisons between what happened at Chernobyl and what is going on at Zaporizhzhia aren't necessarily accurate, despite their geographic proximity. The Chernobyl disaster was a different kind of disaster. It was a situation where the nuclear fuel exploded. This situation would likely be more similar to the Fukushima meltdown that was seen after the earthquake and subsequent tsunami in 2011 that destroyed the plant's cooling systems. It led to the meltdown of 3 reactors and the release of large amounts of radiation, which caused over 160,000 people to need to evacuate. It appears as though, for now, the fire hasn't damaged any key infrastructure, but that doesn't mean anyone is out of the woods yet. The International Atomic Energy Agency soon said the, quote, serious situation had not affected essential equipment at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and that there had been no change in radiation levels. Ukrainian authorities confirmed that the blaze was later extinguished by firefighters today on Friday. Despite how things seem to be relatively under control at the moment, that did not stop Ukrainian President Zelensky from delivering a plea to the rest of Europe and a reminder of just how serious the situation really is. He said, quote, "If there is an explosion, that's the end for everyone. The end for Europe. The evacuation of Europe. Only urgent action by Europe can stop the Russian troops. Do not allow the death of Europe from a catastrophe at a nuclear power station."